This is absolutely ridiculous! I want it off the bill right now!
Sir, you need to calm down immediately.
There is a silent, invisible threshold every human carries within them, a line between who they appear to be on the surface and the hidden storm they are capable of unleashing. Most people spend their entire lives showing the world exactly who they are. They wear their pride on their sleeves, shout their credentials from the rooftops, and demand respect before they have earned it. But then there are those rare individuals who have seen the darkest corners of the earth, who have carried the weight of life and death on their shoulders, and who no longer feel the need to prove anything to anyone. They walk among us unnoticed, blending into the background of everyday life, wrapped in a quiet dignity that naive people often mistake for weakness. On a foggy Tuesday morning in the coastal town of Cape Sterling, a group of reckless young men walked into a small, weather-beaten diner called the Blue Anchor. They believed they were the masters of their universe, fueled by money, privilege, and a complete lack of consequences. They thought they were about to humiliate an ordinary, middle-aged waitress working a minimum wage shift. What they did not realize, what they could not possibly have known, was that the woman standing before them, wearing a faded apron and holding a pot of lukewarm coffee, had spent 10 years commanding elite special warfare units in some of the most dangerous combat zones on the planet. And when they pushed her past the point of restraint, they were about to learn a lesson in respect that would echo through their lives forever. The Blue Anchor was the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. Situated just off the docks, its windows were permanently glazed with a thin film of salt rust, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of decades of fishermen, truck drivers, and early morning commuters. For the past 8 months, Sarah Miller had been the heartbeat of the morning shift. To the regulars, Sarah was simply a polite, soft-spoken woman in her late 30s who kept to herself, worked double shifts without complaining, and always remembered who took 2 sugars and who preferred black coffee. She had a subtle posture, back straight, shoulders relaxed, eyes constantly scanning the room, that gave her a poised presence, though no one paid it much mind. People assumed she was just another struggling local trying to make ends meet in a town where jobs were scarce. Behind the counter that morning was Maya, a 19-year-old high school graduate working her first job to save money for community college. Maya was gentle, timid, and easily shaken by harsh words. Sarah had taken the girl under her wing from day one, teaching her how to handle the rush hour, how to balance heavy trays, and how to remain calm when difficult customers lost their tempers. To Maya, Sarah was more than just a coworker. She was a quiet guardian, a steady rock in a chaotic world. At precisely 7:15, the front door of the diner swung open, letting in a gust of damp morning wind along with 3 young men in their early 20s. Leading the group was Brody Vance, the son of the town's wealthiest real estate developer. Brody was accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. His family owned half the commercial property in Cape Sterling, including the very building the Blue Anchor sat in. Trailing behind him were his 2 frequent companions, Carter and Mason, 2 local enablers who lived in Brody's shadow and amplified his worst impulses. The trio walked in with the loud, performative arrogance typical of people who have never faced real accountability. They slid into the large corner booth, tossing their wet coats over the seats and instantly filling the quiet diner with obnoxious laughter. Maya took a deep breath, picked up 3 menus, and walked over to their table. Her voice trembled slightly as she greeted them, offering them hot coffee to take off the morning chill. Brody didn't even look up at her face. He scoffed, dismissed her greeting with a wave of his hand, and began making snide remarks about the state of the diner, loud enough for everyone to hear. He complained about the smell, the dim lighting, and the service before they had even ordered. Maya tried her best to remain professional, her hands visibly shaking as she wrote down their demands. When she made a minor error in taking down Brody's complicated breakfast order, Brody snapped. He slammed his hand onto the laminate table, the sharp crack echoing through the small restaurant, causing several elderly patrons to flinch. He berated the young girl, calling her incompetent and demanding to speak to whoever was running the place. From across the dining room, Sarah had been watching the interaction with calm, deliberate focus. She didn't panic. She didn't raise her voice. Her heart rate remained perfectly steady, sitting at a calm 60 beats per minute, a physiological response hardwired into her through years of high-stress combat operations. Sarah placed her tray down on the counter, caught Maya's tear-filled eyes, and gently patted the young girl's shoulder. She told Maya to head into the back kitchen, take a breather, and let her handle the table. Maya nodded gratefully and hurried behind the swinging silver doors. Sarah stepped out from behind the counter and walked over to the corner booth. Her gait was smooth, measured, and entirely devoid of fear. As she approached, Brody looked her up and down, taking in her worn apron, her simple tied-back hair, and the faint scars on the back of her hands. He saw a target. He saw someone he believed was beneath him, someone who had no choice but to take whatever abuse he decided to hand out. Sarah stood at the edge of the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her voice was cool, steady, and quiet. She informed Brody that his behavior toward her young colleague was unacceptable, and that if he wished to be served in the establishment, he would need to speak with basic respect. The silence that followed was suffocating. Brody's face flushed with anger. The idea that a simple waitress was dictating terms to him in his father's town was intolerable. His friends chuckled nervously, egging him on. Brody leaned forward, his eyes burning with childish malice. He told Sarah that she was nothing, that her job was to shut up and bring him his food, and that he could have this entire diner shut down by afternoon if he wanted to. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She maintained direct, unwavering eye contact, the kind of look that usually made hardened men look away. That eye contact infuriated Brody beyond reason. In a pathetic, cowardly display of petty dominance, Brody gathered saliva in his mouth and spat directly into Sarah's face. The entire diner froze. The clinking of silverware stopped. The quiet murmur of conversation died instantly. A dark, terrifying silence descended upon the room. Brody smirked, leaning back into the booth with his arms crossed, waiting for the waitress to break down, cry, or run away in humiliation. He expected tears. He expected panic. Instead, Sarah did something that chilled the room to its core. She did not flinch. She did not gasp. Her head did not even tilt back from the impact. Her face remained entirely devoid of emotion, like sculpted marble. Slowly, with terrifyingly precise and deliberate movements, Sarah reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a clean, white linen napkin, and wiped her cheek. Her eyes never left Brody's. The intensity in her gaze was no longer that of a waitress being harassed. It was the sharp, predatory focus of an operator assessing a threat level. In her mind, she was not looking at a customer. She was evaluating a target's posture, heart rate, and physical vulnerabilities. She could have ended the situation in less than 3 seconds. She knew precisely which nerve cluster to strike, how to disarm and neutralize all 3 men before any of them could react. But Sarah had spent a decade mastering the highest levels of combat control, and true power lies in knowing when not to use force. Instead of escalating into physical violence, Sarah calmly folded the dirty napkin, placed it neatly on the center of their table, and spoke in a tone that was so cold, so quiet, and so absolute that it made the blood drain from the faces of Brody's 2 friends. She told them that their meal was canceled, and that they had 10 seconds to stand up and walk out of the diner before the nature of their mourning changed permanently. Brody tried to laugh it off, trying to maintain his tough facade in front of his friends, but the laughter caught in his throat. There was something in Sarah's posture, the way her feet were planted, the complete absence of fear in her stance, that triggered a primal instinct of self-preservation deep within him. Mason and Carter were the first to move. Sensing an invisible danger they couldn't quite articulate, they slid out of the booth and pulled on Brody's jacket, muttering that they should just leave. Brody, unwilling to lose face completely, stood up slowly, threw a crumpled $20 bill onto the floor, and swore that Sarah hadn't seen the last of him. He promised he would bring his father down to destroy this place by the end of the day. Sarah didn't look at the money on the floor. She watched them leave, her eyes tracking their exit through the fogged glass window until their car pulled away. Only then did she take a slow, deep breath, returning her physiological state to baseline. She turned to find the entire diner staring at her in stunned silence. Maya emerged from the kitchen, tears streaming down her face, apologizing profusely for causing the trouble. Sarah simply smiled gently, walked over to Maya, and told her that no one ever needed to apologize for standing up against cruelty. To understand why a woman with Sarah's extraordinary background was working in a small-town diner, one has to go back 3 years. Before she was Sarah the waitress, she was Commander Evelyn Reed of the United States Navy Special Warfare Command. Evelyn had broken through barriers that few thought possible, becoming one of the most elite operational commanders in modern military history. For 10 years, she had led clandestine units into high-risk environments across the globe. She was a master tactician, a decorated officer, and a leader whose men would have followed her into the jaws of hell. However, the cost of that life was steep. Military service at that level does not just take a physical toll, it carves out pieces of your soul. 2 years prior to her arrival in Cape Sterling, Commander Reed was leading a high-stakes reconnaissance mission in a hostile region. During the operation, an unexpected ambush trapped her squad. Her second-in-command, a brilliant, courageous young operator named Marcus Vance, no relation to Brody, but a man who meant the world to her, had laid down suppressive fire to allow the rest of the team to reach the extraction helicopter. Marcus saved the unit, but he paid the ultimate price. Before Marcus passed away in her arms on that evacuation flight, he made Evelyn promise one thing, that she would look after his younger sister, Maya. Marcus had raised Maya after their parents died, and his greatest fear was leaving his sister alone in a cold, unforgiving world. Following that tragic mission, Commander Reed honorably retired from active service. She declined prestigious private security contracts, defense consulting roles, and high-paying executive positions. She didn't want power, money, or recognition. She was exhausted, grieving, and seeking redemption. She tracked down Maya in Cape Sterling, choosing not to reveal her identity or her deep connection to Marcus right away. She wanted to observe, protect, and support the young girl organically, ensuring Maya built a life of her own without feeling like a charity case. Evelyn took the job at the Blue Anchor simply to be near Maya, to serve as a silent guardian while she processed her own grief and found peace in the quiet rhythms of civilian life. The town of Cape Sterling, however, was undergoing its own quiet crisis. Brody's father, Richard Vance, was a ruthless real estate tycoon who had been systematically buying up waterfront properties at forced sell-off prices. His goal was to demolish the historic fishing district, including the Blue Anchor Diner, to make way for a luxury high-rise resort and private marina. The owner of the diner, an elderly widowed veteran named Arthur, had refused repeated buyout offers. Arthur's diner was the last sanctuary for the working-class locals, and he vowed never to sell. Richard Vance was not a man who accepted refusal. He used his wealth, political connections, and local influence to squeeze the small business owners. When legitimate means failed, he deployed subtle intimidation tactics, corrupt health inspectors, sudden tax audits, and the deliberate harassment of patrons by his son, Brody. By afternoon on the day of the incident, the fallout from the diner confrontation began. Brody had gone straight to his father, spinning a twisted narrative of how the waitress at the Blue Anchor had verbally assaulted him, threatened his life, and tried to extort money from him. Richard Vance, eager for any excuse to shut down Arthur's business once and for all, saw this as the ultimate lever. At 4 o'clock, just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade over the harbor, 2 black SUVs pulled up outside the Blue Anchor. Out stepped Richard Vance, accompanied by his son Brody, the town's chief of police, Donald Briggs, and a team of private security guards. The atmosphere inside the diner turned ice cold as the heavy front doors banged open. Richard Vance stepped inside, his designer suit contrasting sharply with the worn vinyl booths and wooden counters. He demanded to see the owner and the waitress who had assaulted his son. Arthur stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, his expression grim. Behind him stood Sarah, calm, unbothered, and completely unfazed by the show of force. Richard Vance began his tirade, his voice echoing off the walls. He threatened legal action, immediate closure of the diner for safety violations, and promised that Sarah would be sitting in a county jail cell by nightfall for assault. Chief Briggs, who was heavily indebted to the Vance family for funding his re-election campaigns, stepped forward with his hand resting ostentatiously on his belt holster. He informed Arthur that due to the serious nature of the complaints, he was shutting the establishment down immediately pending a full investigation, and that Sarah needed to put her hands behind her back. The local patrons in the diner began to murmur in anger, but the presence of the armed police chief and private guards kept them quiet. Brody stood behind his father, a self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. He caught Sarah's eye and mouthed the words, "I told you so." Sarah didn't move an inch. She didn't look at Chief Briggs's handcuffs. Instead, she folded her arms and looked directly at Richard Vance. She remarked on how remarkable it was that a man of his standing would rely on the fabrication of a child who spat on women when he didn't get his way. She noted that leadership built on intimidation was nothing more than a castle built on sand. Richard laughed patronizingly, telling her that her opinions meant nothing in this town, and that power was the only thing that mattered. He declared that she was a nobody, a disposable waitress with no standing, no leverage, and no future. It was at that precise moment that the ground began to shift. Before Chief Briggs could take a step towards Sarah, the sharp sound of heavy military boots echoed on the pavement outside. A sleek, unmarked dark silver sedan pulled up directly behind the police vehicles. Two men in crisp, dark formal suits stepped out, followed by a high-ranking military officer wearing a navy dress uniform covered in ribbons and stars. The front door of the diner opened, and Vice Admiral Thomas Sterling, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Development Group, walked into the Blue Anchor. The entire room went dead silent. Chief Briggs froze mid-step. Even Richard Vance, a man accustomed to manipulating local politicians, was taken aback by the sudden, overwhelming authority of an active four-star military official standing in a small-town diner. Admiral Sterling didn't look at Richard Vance. He didn't look at the police chief. His eyes scanned the room until they landed directly on Sarah. The Admiral stopped, stood at rigid attention, and delivered a crisp, formal hand salute. "Commander Reed," Admiral Sterling said, his voice deep, resonant, and carrying absolute respect. "It has been too long." The silence in the diner was absolute. Brody's jaw dropped. Chief Briggs slowly pulled his hand away from his belt. Richard Vance stared in utter disbelief, his eyes darting between the four-star admiral and the woman holding a dish towel. Sarah lowered her head slightly, offered a brief, respectful nod, and replied, "Admiral, I told you I retired from public life." "You did, Commander," Admiral Sterling responded, lowering his salute. "But the Navy does not forget its finest tactical minds. And more importantly, your country does not forget the lives you saved." The Admiral turned slowly to face Richard Vance and Chief Briggs. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from local intimidation to high-level federal authority. Admiral Sterling handed a thick black leather folder to one of his aides, who opened it to display a series of official documents, active federal protection orders, and high-level security clearance badges. Admiral Sterling informed the room of who Sarah really was. He detailed Commander Evelyn Reed's 10 years of distinguished service as one of the highest decorated special warfare commanders in the nation's history. He spoke of her leadership in combat, her tactical intelligence, her sacrifice, and the Congressional Medal of Honor recommendation currently sitting on the President's desk for her actions during her final deployment. He then turned his gaze directly onto Brody Vance. Furthermore, Admiral Sterling continued, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "We were informed of an incident that occurred in this establishment this morning. Harassing and assaulting a decorated commander of the United States Armed Forces is not merely a civil dispute, Mr. Vance. It is a federal matter, especially when taking place on property currently under review for federal historic preservation." The color completely drained from Brody's face. He looked at his father for help, but Richard Vance was speechless, his authority utterly evaporated in the presence of true power. However, the major reveal of the day was far from over. Sarah stepped forward, her calm demeanor holding the entire room captive. She looked at Richard Vance and stated that while he was busy trying to use his son to bully small businesses, he had forgotten that real intelligence officers never stop paying attention to details. Over the past 8 months, while working at the diner, Sarah hadn't just been serving coffee. She had noticed the illegal dumping of commercial waste by Vance Development into the local harbor, the systematic tax fraud carried out through his front companies, and the illegal coercion used to force local property owners off their land. Using her vast network of former intelligence contacts and military legal experts, Sarah had quietly compiled a rock-solid dossier, detailing every single illegal operation Richard Vance had conducted over the past decade. She had submitted the entire package to the Department of Justice 3 weeks prior. Sarah looked Richard Vance dead in the eye and revealed that the federal warrants for his arrest, along with seizure orders for his development firm, had been signed earlier that morning. As if on cue, 2 federal agents stepped through the diner door, carrying official badges and arrest warrants. Within minutes, the powerful real estate tycoon who thought he owned the town was placed in handcuffs. His son, Brody, paralyzed by shock and shame, was taken into custody alongside him for federal obstruction and assault charges. Chief Briggs, realizing his own career and freedom were over, stood in terrified silence as his badge was confiscated on the spot. The patrons inside the diner erupted into quiet gasps, followed by a wave of applause and emotional murmurs. The shadow of fear that had hung over Cape Sterling for years was lifted in a single, extraordinary hour. When the chaos cleared and the authorities led the disgraced Vance family away, the diner returned to a quiet stillness. Admiral Sterling offered Commander Reed a full reinstatement to active duty, inviting her to lead a prestigious strategic training division at the Naval War College. It was an honor that most military officers could only dream of achieving. Sarah looked around the diner. She looked at old Arthur, who was wiping a tear from his eye, knowing his beloved diner was finally safe. She looked at the regulars who had welcomed her without knowing her title or her past. And finally, she looked at Maya, who was standing near the counter, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, pride, and realization. Sarah turned to Admiral Sterling, offered a gentle, appreciative smile, and respectfully declined the offer. She explained that for 10 years, her duty had been to serve her country on the battlefield. But now, her duty was right here, protecting the people who needed a home, honoring the promise she made to a fallen brother, and serving a community that had given her peace. After the Admiral and his team departed, Sarah walked over to Maya. With tears in her eyes, Maya asked Sarah why she had stayed, why someone so important, so powerful, would choose to work alongside her in a small, quiet diner. Sarah took Maya's hands into her own, her voice soft and filled with warm emotion. She revealed the truth about Marcus, how he was the brave soldier she had ever known, how much he loved his sister, and how her ultimate mission was never about medals or command, but about ensuring that Maya was safe, happy, and surrounded by people who cared for her. Maya threw her arms around Sarah, breaking into tears of profound relief and gratitude. The burden of isolation that both women had carried for so long melted away in that warm embrace. In the weeks that followed, the town of Cape Sterling transformed. The Blue Anchor remained open, designated as a historic landmark protected by the community. Arthur officially made Sarah a co-owner of the diner, ensuring that the sanctuary for the locals would stand for generations to come. Maya enrolled in her dream college course, supported by a scholarship fund established in her brother Marcus's honor. Brody and his father faced full legal accountability for their actions, their empire of control replaced by a restored sense of justice and unity throughout the town. Sarah continued to work the morning shift. She still wore her simple apron, still poured hot coffee for the early morning fishermen, and still greeted every customer with a kind, soft-spoken smile. She never spoke of her medals. She never bragged about her past. She didn't need to. Because true strength is not demonstrated by loud threats, arrogant displays, or the power to intimidate others. True strength is found in the quiet resolve to protect the innocent, the humility to serve others, and the courage to remain kind in a world that so often forgets the value of respect. And as the morning sun broke through the foggy harbor, illuminating the warm interior of the Blue Anchor, everyone who walked through those doors knew that the quiet waitress behind the counter was a reminder to us all. Never judge a person by the apron they wear, for you never know the heart of a hero standing right in front of you.